Have you ever noticed something strange when you're flying on a commercial airplane? At 38,000 feet above the Earth, you can still look up and see even more sky above you, and that raises a simple question. If airplanes are already flying that high, why do they stop there? Why not 50,000 feet, or even 70,000 feet? After all, the higher a plane flies, the thinner the air becomes. And thinner air should make flying easier and more efficient. So what's really stopping them? It turns out the limit isn't the engine power, it isn't the pilot, and it isn't even the aircraft itself. It's the atmosphere. And beyond a certain height, the sky quietly becomes one of the most difficult places an airplane can safely operate. At first, flying higher sounds like the perfect strategy. As an aircraft climbs, the air becomes thinner, and thinner air creates less resistance as the airplane moves forward. Less resistance means less drag. Less drag means less fuel burned, and fuel is one of the largest expenses in aviation. So airlines naturally want their aircraft flying as high as safely possible. That's why after takeoff, airplanes keep climbing steadily until they reach their cruising altitude, high above most weather and turbulence. But something interesting happens as altitude increases. The advantages keep growing, until suddenly they stop growing, and then they begin turning into disadvantages. Jet engines don't work without air. They pull air in, compress it, mix it with fuel, ignite it, and push exhaust backward to create thrust. As altitude increases, the amount of oxygen available to the engines decreases. At around 40,000 feet, the atmosphere is already extremely thin. There is only about 1/4 of the air available compared to sea level. Climb higher than this, and engines begin losing efficiency. They don't suddenly stop working, but they slowly produce less thrust. And at high altitude, even small changes in engine performance can make a very big difference. Engines are only part of the story. Wings depend on air too. Lift is created when air flows over and under the wings and creates a pressure difference that keeps the aircraft in the sky. But thinner air means weaker lift. So the aircraft must fly faster to stay airborne. And flying faster introduces another challenge entirely, because now the aircraft begins moving closer to the speed of sound. At very high altitude, something unusual begins happening. The safe speed range of the aircraft starts shrinking. Fly too slowly, and the wings stop producing enough lift. Fly too fast, and airflow around the aircraft begins changing dramatically as it approaches its high-speed limits. Shock waves begin forming over parts of the wings. Control becomes less predictable. Between those two speeds is a narrow, safe zone where normal flight is possible. Pilots call this zone the coffin corner. And the higher the aircraft climbs, the smaller this safe zone becomes. Eventually, there simply isn't enough margin left for safe operation, so the aircraft stops climbing. Not because it can't go higher, but because it shouldn't. There's another invisible challenge happening during every flight that most passengers never notice. Even though the aircraft is flying at nearly 40,000 feet, the cabin feels like you're sitting somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. That's because the cabin is pressurized. Air is constantly pumped inside the aircraft to keep passengers comfortable and safe. But the higher the aircraft climbs, the greater the pressure difference becomes between the inside of the cabin and the air outside. And that difference places stress on the structure of the airplane. The fuselage, the windows, the doors, the seals. Everything is being pushed outward by that pressure. Aircraft are designed very carefully to handle this safely, but only up to certain limits. Climbing much higher would require stronger and heavier aircraft structures, which would reduce efficiency and increase fuel consumption. And that defeats the entire purpose of flying higher in the first place. There's also another important limit that pilots think about called the service ceiling. This is the highest altitude where the aircraft can still climb at a safe and controlled rate. Above this height, the airplane may still technically fly, but it can no longer climb efficiently or safely. Most commercial aircraft already cruise surprisingly close to this upper boundary. Here's something else most passengers never notice. Commercial aircraft often climb higher during the flight itself, not all at once, but gradually. As fuel burns, the airplane becomes lighter, and a lighter airplane needs less lift to stay in the air. So pilots slowly move the aircraft higher as the journey continues. This process is called a step climb. It allows the aircraft to remain inside the most efficient altitude range throughout the flight. Another reason airplanes don't simply keep climbing higher is temperature. At cruising altitude, the air outside the aircraft is often colder than -50 degrees Celsius. Cold air actually helps engines perform better, but only up to a point. Eventually, the air becomes so thin that the temperature advantage is no longer useful. Beyond that altitude, engine performance begins dropping again. There's also something surprising about the sky that most people never realize. Airplanes don't just avoid flying too high, they also avoid flying too low once they reach cruise. Lower altitudes contain thicker air, and thicker air creates more drag. More drag means more fuel burned. Lower altitudes also contain more weather, more turbulence, and more air traffic. So commercial aircraft operate inside a narrow vertical corridor where everything works together efficiently. Interestingly, some aircraft are designed to fly much higher than commercial airliners. Military reconnaissance aircraft like the U-2 can fly above 70,000 feet. They can do this because they are extremely lightweight and have very long wings designed specifically for thin air. But flying that high places them very close to their stall limits the entire time. Passenger aircraft are not designed to operate like that. Even the famous Concorde followed a completely different strategy. It cruised at around 60,000 feet, but it could do this because it flew at more than twice the speed of sound and used a very different aerodynamic design from modern passenger jets. It also carried fewer passengers and consumed far more fuel per seat than modern aircraft, which is one of the reasons supersonic passenger travel never became common. Modern commercial aviation is built around a balance between safety, comfort, efficiency, and reliability. And that balance exists inside a surprisingly thin layer of the atmosphere. Too low, and drag increases. Fuel burn increases. Weather becomes rougher. Too high, and engines lose efficiency. Lift becomes harder to maintain. Structural stress increases. And safe operating speed margins begin disappearing. Somewhere between these extremes lies the perfect cruising altitude. At around 35,000 to 40,000 feet, all of these factors balance together. That's why nearly every commercial aircraft you fly on cruises in this narrow band of sky. It's not random. It's the atmosphere's sweet spot. Commercial airplanes don't simply fly as high as they can. They fly exactly where physics allows them to operate safely and efficiently. The sky above your window may look endless, but the part humans can comfortably travel through at 500 miles per hour is surprisingly thin. And now you know why your plane stays right where it does. If you enjoy exploring the hidden science and forgotten logic behind everyday things like this, subscribe to Ordinary Things Deep History, because sometimes the most ordinary questions have the deepest stories behind them.